While Australia's rollout is slowly gaining pace, in some countries a third COVID vaccine booster shot is being introduced for the more vulnerable people in the community. Let's bring in Professor Mary Louise McLaws, advisor to the World Health Organisation. Mary Louise, it's always good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us again tonight.
It's a pleasure, Michael.
Now, there's speculation a COVID vaccine booster will be necessary for anyone wanting to travel overseas. Let's talk about boosters and explain that for us, please.
So your first shot primes you and gets your body to produce antibodies. And of course, you also have a T cell response. So your immunity to the virus is quite complicated, but we usually just talk about antibodies. Then your second vaccine is called the booster one, where it reminds and wakes up your immune system, and then you're supposed to be good to go for quite some time. However, with more research done, and as we're learning more about COVID-19, it would appear as if we would need another shot, preferably around 8 months, but that really depends on what your vaccine efficacy was. So the lower the vaccine efficacy, we might need a booster shot sooner than, say, 8 months. But it's all a bit of a learning curve, so the population need to be fairly relaxed with us when we explain that you might need a booster shot. If you have AstraZeneca, it's 6 months, or you might need it at 8 months if you've had Pfizer. And it really will depend on what variant is circulating as well. And it's a bit like the flu, in that we have a new flu shot each year because of the way it might change. And there's something called shift and drift, the way the virus changes. And some years it doesn't work well to last year's influenza shot. And the same thing may happen with this one. So we have to be prepared to have maybe not just seasonal, which implies annual vaccines, but maybe for a couple of years we might have to have them a bit sooner.
So we're talking about a third shot, to be clear on that, a third vaccination.
Correct. We're talking about a third shot. Now, the research is still being done. In the UK, they're starting to roll out that third shot. And remember, in the UK, they mainly use AstraZeneca, like we do for our over 60s. And they started rolling out in mid-December. And so now is around the right time for them to start thinking about rolling out a booster shot. But they'll be doing research as well, hopefully doing blood samples to check your antibody level and looking at whether or not that is declining and when it's best for you to have your booster shot. Is it 8 months or is it a bit sooner? And does it change depending on your age? Because we know as you get older, your immune system gets a little tired.
So age dependent perhaps, but also brand or type of vaccine dependent as well? Will everybody have to have a booster?
I think everybody will have to have a booster. And the Oxford University researchers are doing work looking at different types of doses. So they're doing studies looking at the first dose being AstraZeneca or Pfizer, and then the second dose being a different one. And it looks as if that mix and match may give you a better boost response if you have AstraZeneca first and then Pfizer next. And Angela Merkel had a mix and match, possibly because she had to go to a meeting. So she needed her Pfizer fairly quickly instead of waiting 3 months for her second shot of AstraZeneca. And we'll probably see that later on in this pandemic, that those of us who've had 2 shots of AstraZeneca, when we get to have our third booster, it may well be with a messenger RNA vaccine.
Will we need a booster to travel internationally? Will boosters allow us to create travel bubbles, do you think?
That's a really good question. And what we'll need, the Chinese have already been using this, and that is date of your vaccine, the manufacturer, the type of vaccine, and also they use antibody levels. So they test for antibody levels, and you carry this passport around. And the EU is developing across 7 countries in the EU. They're developing their own with similarly what the manufacturer was when you had it. But I would suggest that they're probably going to have to also look at the date and when you're due for your booster.
I just wonder, I mean, in a country like the United States where AstraZeneca still hasn't been approved by the FDA, and there are some clauses in why they haven't done that, it's not just a blanket that they haven't done it. In a country like America where they haven't approved AstraZeneca, if we want to travel there, might we then have to, if you've had AstraZeneca here, go and get a Pfizer booster or another brand booster?
Mm-hmm. Michael, that's certainly the gossip that perhaps we might not be able to get in even with 2 doses of AstraZeneca. I haven't seen anything absolutely definitive yet, but also this might fit in with everybody getting that 3rd booster with the Pfizer, so that we can, of course, go into the US. One of the problems with the passport, the vaccine passport, is the inequity of it, because there are going to be very many low-income countries that can't afford the messenger RNA vaccines because they're expensive. And therefore, if they have been vaccinated, they may be kept out of a country. So what needs to be included in that vaccine passport is some sort of certificate that says that religiously or medically you can't have a vaccine, or that you've had something like AstraZeneca, and then test you at the border to make sure that you're not carrying the virus and let you in, because otherwise they're making the have and the have-nots, and that's totally unacceptable, and certainly WHO doesn't agree with that approach.
We don't want to scare people, but we've only really just got a head around the Delta variant, but now the Lambda coronavirus variant has arrived on Australian shores. What do we know about that?
Well, Michael, don't be too anxious yet. Certainly it's been labelled by the UK as and other countries as a variant under investigation. So they haven't made it yet a variant of concern, but it does look in South American countries to have a much lower response, a much higher response to the vaccine. In other words, your body doesn't react very well when you've got a vaccine plus you've got Lambda. You're not going to be fighting Lambda as well, and apparently it could even impact the vaccine worse than Delta. So it just hasn't been called a variant of concern yet, because we don't know if it causes more death or more severe infection.
Well, we'll worry about that when we need to come back and talk to you about it. For now, we'll still focus on Delta, I think. For our viewers in New South Wales, I think they're eagerly awaiting the Premier's decision, which is meant to be tomorrow, on lifting lockdown. 18 locally acquired cases today, 2 in the community. At this rate, should the lockdown be extended, do you think? And if so, should schools return on Monday?
Well, from an outbreak management perspective, I think it's too soon, because 2 of the 3 variables that you look at is how many of the cases were out in the community. 7 were partially out and 2 were completely out. Now, that gives you a percentage of cases today, somewhere between 11% and 39%, that were potentially spreading it. That's quite high. It's been around a third to a half over the last few days of people who haven't been under isolation when they've been diagnosed, and that's very high. Now, yes, 11%, but if we add the partial, it's still too high. Yeah. And then the other variable that you use is geographical spread. And so we're still waiting to see what's happening in Auburn and other places around Sydney, what's happening in all the 500 healthcare workers on furlough and being isolated, and whether or not they've sadly infected anybody else in the community. So I think that with an abundance of caution, I don't think we'll be lifting the restrictions on Friday unless something wonderful happens between now and then.
So just would it mean then, with that advice and that experience of yours, would that mean another 2 or 3 days, or another full week or 2 weeks in a lockdown to be cautious?
To be cautious, the minimum would be 7 days,
Right.
but the correct thing to do would be 14. And I think 14 would be stretching the friendship greatly
Yeah.
by the community. But 7 days, they might have a really good idea about how many might have escaped, into the greater community without the authorities knowing.
I think we're still seeing some pockets of complacency too, just small people, small amounts of people who are gathering in groups and not social distancing. Do you think there's still a level of complacency and, I don't know, could you call it pandemic fatigue in a way?
Well, I think, Michael, that they're a bit confused. I mean, they heard the quite correct rhetoric by the authorities that this was a very serious variant of concern. I mean, the UK has reported just recently, they do routine testing of the community, and they've reported that in April, Delta was 30 to 60%, and then it jumped up to 90%. And the very worrying result was that 5-year-olds to 12-year-olds are driving Delta. So it doesn't look as if they're acquiring it from a family cluster. It looks like they're acquiring it in the community. But that's an assumption, but it's still a very scary one because, they and the 18 to 24-year-olds are the two biggest groups with the highest amount of infection in the UK, and they tested over 100,000 people. So we need to take note of that. And I don't think that kids should be going back to school next week, sadly. I know they love to go back to school, but we just need to make sure that this hasn't, leaked into any of the school community.
So that's the different thing this time around with Delta, isn't it? It's the young infections, and we really have to pay attention to that, is what you're saying.
Correct. So you need to pay really specific attention to the fact that we don't want the young catching this. The UK are starting to warn everybody that the young, little kids are getting what's termed long COVID. And we're not actually looking at long COVID, but they have support systems overseas in the UK, and they have been quite shocked at the number of kids who are still sick after 12 weeks.
Yeah. That is not good. All right, we do need to pay attention to that. Before you go to, obviously, staying on the theme of Europe, a lot of it is opening up. We've seen our reporter in Italy and people out and about. It's open borders and off you go again. Tell me about lateral flow tests, because I think we're going to hear a bit more about that. It's part of returning to normal life. Why have we not seen these rolled out in Australia? What are they?
Look, the scientific medical community are very resistant to lateral flow testing. They're very fast. The ones they use in the UK take about 30 minutes. You can pick up a kit from many areas, such as, libraries, pharmacies, and collection points. You're given them. They're about 99.9% accurate, so there's a small inaccuracy. But what they want people to do is test themselves twice a week. And they're suggesting that schools and universities and some employers use them as well. And then what you do is when you get the test result, you put your test result online or you ring up. So, and they're asking people, don't use this if you have symptoms. Only use it if you're asymptomatic, because these tests are very good at picking up the viral load in those first 5 to 7 days before you become symptomatic. And I think with these lateral flow tests, they really are going to make an enormous difference in cooperation, in people staying at home. I mean, most people won't want to move around knowing that they've had a test, and they've got a really good sense of duty to stay away from people when they're sick. And I think we should be bringing them in, even though there's a very small chance of inaccuracy. At the moment, we have no accuracy of what's out there in the community.
So it's a quick swab you can do yourself, is that what it is? Okay.
That's right. So you do a throat swab and a nose swab, and it's a quick one. Okay. Now, these lateral flow tests, you can actually send the swab back into laboratories, or you can have a kit where you do it yourself, and it's a bit like a pregnancy test.
All right. Well, maybe it's something we should be looking at too, whilst we have this, slow rollout. We've got some time to have a think about that as well. All right, Mary Louise, always good to talk to you. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Stay well.